Race Relations has raised concerns over what it calls government's attempt to plunder South Africans' private savings. The institute accuses government of planning to seize private pension funds to plug spending gaps. Now, the institute is reacting to a statement by Trade and Industry Minister Ibrahim Patel that retirement funds play a role in the country's development. So for more on this, I'm joined now by Gabriel Krauser, who's from the Institute of Race Relations. Gabriel, thanks a lot for joining us on Newsnight this evening. You are calling it really an attempt to actually seize the wealth of the private sector. Explain that concept to me.
Right. So the first thing to note is that South Africa's got a huge pension fund pot, sort of like a pot of gold, about 4 trillion rand. So it's a lot of money, and so far it's been protected from what people sometimes call state capture, but sort of a larger problem of corruption and mismanagement.
This is private, let's be clear, this is private sector pension funds now.
Right.
Okay, good, gotcha.
So at the moment, those private sector funds have the choice to more or less invest their money where they'd like. There's some limitations on how much can go overseas, but within the country they can pick and choose winners and losers as they think is going to be best for the pensioners. And there may be 11 to 13 million of them. It's a lot of South Africans who depend on this. Now, that pot of gold is obviously extremely attractive, and the state-owned enterprises in this country are in deep trouble. Eskom's debt is nearly at 500 billion, 400 and something billion rand. They want to cover that debt. They're not able to raise cheap credit internationally because we've got a very bad track record of governance, and we've got a very poor record of, we talk up the reform, but very little has actually happened in that regard. So to plug the gap, you can take the money from the big pot of gold, slosh it into Eskom, slosh it into SAA, into SABC, and then it looks like you've solved the problem. But, of course, the losers are going to be pensioners themselves.
I have to understand this, though, Gabriel, from a perspective of a business owner or an entrepreneur. Let's say that one ex-entrepreneur has got a company that employs, let's say, 10 people, right? Those people they're on a permanent contract, so therefore they've got a pension fund and amongst other benefits, correct? Good. So I get to decide as a company in terms of where those investment options are for the benefit of the employees, correct? So in that regard, are you telling me now the government is planning to come to X company and say, hey, we need your pension fund, and how will that work then?
Yeah, well, so they won't say we need the whole pension fund, but they'll say you are legally mandated to buy assets, and we're going to give you the list of assets that you have to buy into. So they can say you have to buy into Eskom, you have to buy into SAA, you have to buy into SABC. And look, this has happened already with Transnet pensioners. Their pension fund was managed by the Transnet pension fund, and they sort of felt like we need to pick and choose where we're investing, not on the basis of what's going to get us the greatest rate of return, but on what the key state interests are. So it ended up getting invested in Sanral and other failed projects. Pensioners who should have been getting thousands or tens of thousands now are getting 20 rand a month, as little as 20 rand a month. They can't survive on that, so they move into their kid's place. They try and start something when they're 60, but it's extremely difficult. And often older people and pensioners are the sole kind of financially sound entity within a larger family unit. So you really are taking from people who can't afford to have stuff taken away from them and investing it into companies, state-owned enterprises that are not looking good. Now, we should be clear on this. This is not yet government policy. This is not yet a bill under law.
This is just speaking. These are just rhetorics that are being spoken on public platforms, because this was by the minister.
Yes.
So it is on public platforms regarding the would-be plan, should there be. But if there's an outcry as a result of this, and the reason why I'm saying that is because any form of private sector, the beauty about private sector is the fact that they've got autonomy. They've got the beauty of determining what direction the business goes. And if the private entity in itself decides, well, then in that case, tell you what, we won't make all employees permanent. We will not give them benefits. Rather, let's place them all on some kind of freelance contract or some kind of temporary contract, which then takes away the issues around, cutting out on taxes, cutting out on pension funds, cutting out on UIF, all the other fairy stuff. Pay them a lump sum of money. They get to take care of things themselves. Does that then not encourage, or should I say force, private sector to actually take those kinds of drastic measures?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is probably going to push them in all kinds of directions. One of the things that you'll see is the attempt to make shell companies that seem to be based in South Africa but are really based overseas in order to greater leverage more successful markets outside of South Africa. Another is, as you say, to kind of write off the permanent contracts as far as possible and put people in freelance positions. Now, that kind of move generally one of the reasons that pensions and long-term health plans and stuff like that built into your contract kind of work is that if you have an employee who feels loyal to the company, because the company's invested in that employee over their lifetime and the employee's invested in the company, they're likely to work in a more long-term focused and productive way. This kind of cutthroat freelance option has its attractions, but it's certainly not something that you want to have be forced on by regulation. It's just going to, I think, weaken the labor market, weaken the commitment to companies. And all of this stuff, what it really does is send a big signal that there's an elephant in the room and we don't want to look at it.
But could there be
real
a
reform
good solution to that, though, Gabriel? And allow me to play, because there are two sides to every story, right? So on the other side of it, could that not be a way in which we can, for the bigger picture, right, salvage some of the issues that, yes, our parastatals are faced with? Yes, looking at our financial troubles and our economic troubles, is that not a way of solving some of those issues and actually getting return on investment, provided that the people at the helm that are in charge of investing are, number one, not corrupt, and number two, are not out there to make a quick buck on their own from a state-owned perspective?
Yeah, no, I like the question, but I think that the trouble is that if Eskom was really reformed, if Eskom was going to start making more money than it's losing, you'd find all kinds of creditors willing to get in there and at lower rates than they're getting in there now. The prescribed asset scheme is basically the government take a gun to the head of the people in charge of those pension funds in the form of the taxman and the police and the regulatory authorities and saying, you must put money here. If they're forcing that rather than doing the reform, then that money is going to be lost. Some value there's going to be lost, and you're hitting people who really can't afford to lose the money. If you go forward with the real reform, the chairman, Jobu Mabuza, said a third of Eskom is sort of redundant employees. If you retrench those people, it is very sad for that 10,000 plus number of people, but you've got a huge sort of gain to be had nationwide, because it would be a signal to the markets that this is a serious enterprise. Turning around Eskom is a serious enterprise, and we can get involved with that. If you're serious, you sell off, you privatize SAA, which is basically just a glory project. There's no real key sort of there's no use for it to ordinary South Africans. It's great for politicians who can fly around for slightly cheaper in business class, but for the rest of us, it's no good. You can sell that asset off, write it off the books, the government can start eating into its debt. If you take the other option of saying, no, we want to build the country together, we need to work together, but we're doing it with a gun to our heads, then I think the story sort of speaks for itself. Then the government is not being serious about doing the reforms, it's just digging the hole further, and this time it's using us as the shovel.
Gabriel, we're going to leave our conversation there, but I think that anybody would have caught exactly what she's trying to communicate this evening. Gabriel Krauser from the Institute of